The air in the great hall of Arendor was a weapon. It was sharp enough to steal the breath from a man's lungs, cold enough to crack stone. Queen Seraine Valter sat on her throne of sculpted ice, the architect of this beautiful, lethal frost, and felt nothing. She watched her breath plume before her lips. A soft cloud of white in the crystalline air, but the chill that painted the hall in filigrees of silver and diamond was a stranger to her skin. It was her power, her curse, her crown. An eternal winter she commanded, but could never truly feel. Her throne, the glacial spire, was carved from the heart of a frozen mountain and pulsed with a faint blue light that mirrored the emptiness in her chest. Below her, the assembled court shivered in their furs and velvets, their faces pinched and pale. They were her subjects, the children of the long winter she had wrought to protect them from the blighted lands beyond their borders. They revered her, they feared her, but they could never understand the profound isolation of a ruler who could raise a fortress of ice with a flick of her wrist, but could not remember the simple sensation of warmth on her face. Today was the rite of Winter's heart, the annual ceremony where she reaffirmed her bond with the kingdom's core, a ritual that anchored the unyielding cold and kept the encroaching southern blights at bay. It was a day of power, a display meant to quell dissent and remind every soul in Arendor that she alone was their shield. Yet to Seraine, it was merely a performance of a strength that felt more like a cage. Her gaze swept over the court, landing on Lord Vorlog. His beard was frosted with his own breath, his eyes like chips of flint. He was the loudest of the dissenters, the one who whispered in shadowed alcoves that her eternal winter was starving the realm, that a pact with the southern fire-wielders was better than a slow death by ice. He thought her weak, her power a brittle thing that would one day shatter. He was a fool. Her power was not brittle. It was absolute. It was her heart that was the fragile, frozen thing. A chamberlain, his voice trembling slightly, struck a crystal gong. The sound chimed through the hall, a pure high note that seemed to hang in the frigid air forever. It was time. Seraine rose, the silver threads in her gown glittering like captured starlight. She was tall, her form as severe and elegant as a shard of ice, her white blonde hair braided with pearls that seemed to weep frozen tears. Every eye was upon her, a mixture of awe and terror. She descended the shallow steps from her throne, her movements fluid and silent. The center of the hall held the font of Arendor, a wide, shallow basin carved into the floor, filled with a substance that was not quite water and not quite ice. It was pure, liquid cold, the source of her power. As she approached, the air grew even colder, a pressure that made the nobles flinch and pull their cloaks tighter. Seraine felt only the familiar hum of her own magic, a song without melody, a power without passion. She extended a hand, her skin unnaturally pale, her fingers long and slender. She remembered in vague, childish flashes a time before the curse had taken her, a time of sunlight, a time when a touch could mean comfort, not just the transfer of a killing frost. The memories were like faded tapestries, their colors bleached by a century of cold. She paused, her fingers hovering just above the surface of the font. She could see her own reflection, a woman with eyes the color of a winter sky, her expression a mask of regal indifference. "Is this all I will ever be?" the thought whispered, a traitor in the silent fortress of her mind. A monument of ice? She pushed the doubt away and plunged her hand into the font. The impact was not physical, but arcane. A shockwave of pure frost erupted from the basin, silent and invisible. Yet every person in the hall felt it in the marrow of their bones. It raced through the palace, reinforcing its structure, sharpening the edges of the ice-carved gargoyles on the ramparts, and spreading out across the kingdom. The magical wards that protected Arendor from the fire-wielding lands to the south flared with renewed strength, a shimmering curtain of arctic light visible for leagues. In the hall, new frost bloomed across the vaulted ceiling, intricate patterns of fern and stars spiraling out from the font, a testament to her absolute control. The court gasped, a collective sound of reverence. Even Lord Vorlog seemed to recoil, his skepticism momentarily silenced by the raw, untamed power on display. Seraine withdrew her hand, the liquid cold clinging to her skin for a moment, before freezing into a delicate, crystalline glove. She had done her duty. Arendor was safe for another year. She turned to face her court, her expression unreadable, the silent queen in her silent kingdom. And then the world trembled. It was not the deep, resonant shudder of her own magic. This was a violent, jarring quake that came from below, shaking the ice palace to its foundations. A low, guttural roar echoed from outside, a sound of such primal fury that it vibrated through the floor and up Serene's spine. It was a sound of heat and rage, a sound that had no place in her frozen world. Panic rippled through the court. Nobles cried out, stumbling back from the great window at the far end of the hall. The royal guard, clad in armor of enchanted ice, formed a protective ring around her, their spears leveled towards the entrance. "What is it?" Vorlog demanded, his earlier composure shattered. "An earthquake?" Serene knew better. This was no movement of the earth. This was an arrival. She felt it as a foreign pressure against her wards, a searing, aggressive heat that was actively pushing against her dominion of cold. The scent of ozone and scorched earth seeped into the hall, a cloying alien smell that made her stomach clench. On the massive ice-paned window that depicted Arendor's founding, a single drop of water trickled down the glass, then another and another. The ice was melting. "Impossible," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind that had begun to howl outside. The roar came again, closer this time, deafening and full of ancient hunger. The great window, which had stood for 100 years, began to hiss and steam. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, not from force, but from an impossible, encroaching warmth. The court screamed as the entire pane of sculpted ice dissolved into a cascade of boiling water and shattered into a million pieces, exploding inward with a concussive blast. A wave of heat washed into the hall, so intense it was like standing before an open furnace. It struck Serene with the force of a physical blow. For the first time in her life, a sensation pierced the veil of her curse. It was not warmth, it was pain. A burning, blistering agony that made her skin cry out in protest. Her guards were thrown back, their ice armor steaming and melting into useless puddles around them. Framed in the shattered window, against a sky that had turned a bruised orange, was a beast of legend, a dragon. It was colossal, its scales the color of cooling lava and gleaming obsidian, its underbelly a river of molten gold. Plumes of black smoke billowed from its nostrils, and its eyes were twin pits of fire. It was the living embodiment of everything her world was not: heat, chaos, and untamed, violent life. The dragon lowered its massive head, and in a shimmer of incandescent heat, it changed. The monstrous form dissolved into the shape of a man who dropped lightly to the floor of her hall, landing amidst the steaming puddles of what was once her window. He was tall and broad-shouldered, forged in a fire that Serene could not comprehend. He wore no furs, only dark leather armor and steel that seemed to glow with residual heat. His hair was the black of volcanic rock, and his skin was tanned by a sun she had never felt. Scars marred his features, one cutting a pale line through a dark eyebrow, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of embers, glowing with an inner light that seemed to see straight through her frigid facade into the frozen core of her. Heat radiated from him in waves, melting the very floor around his boots. "Blasphemy!" Lord Vorlog snarled, finding his courage in his outrage. "A fireborn cur dares to enter the glacial spire. Guards, slay the beast!" Several of Vorlog's personal guard, braver or more foolish than the rest, charged forward with swords drawn. The stranger did not even honor them with a full glance. He made a lazy, dismissive gesture with one hand. A wall of shimmering heat erupted before him, and the guards' steel swords glowed cherry red, then white-hot, melting in their hands like wax. They cried out, dropping the molten slag and stumbling back, clutching their burned fingers. The fireborn warlord's gaze swept over them with utter contempt, dismissing them as insects. Then his eyes found Serene, and the world narrowed to the space between them. He ignored her cowering court, her terrified guards. His focus was solely, terrifyingly on her. He took a step forward, and the ice on the floor hissed and retreated from his tread. He walked toward the dais, his stride confident and predatory. The air around him was a torment, a blistering aura that made her own magic recoil. It was an agony she had never known, a feeling so intense it was almost a perverse pleasure after a lifetime of numbness. Her heart, a slow and sluggish thing in her chest, began to hammer a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. He stopped at the foot of her throne, looking up at her. He did not bow. He did not kneel. He simply watched her, his fiery eyes dissecting her, peeling back the layers of queen, sorceress, and ice. "They told stories of you in the south," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding in the belly of a volcano. "The Winter Queen, a ghost in a palace of glass. They were wrong." He took another step, ascending to her level. "You are no ghost." His gaze was so intense she felt it like a brand. "You are a flame that has been frozen. I can see it burning under all that ice." She flinched. No one had ever spoken to her with such raw, insolent familiarity. No one had ever dared to stand so close, to bring their world-destroying heat into her sanctum of cold. "You are trespassing, Dragon Lord," she said, her voice betraying none of the chaos inside her. It came out as she intended, cold, sharp, and brittle. "Leave this place, or you will be entombed in it." A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. "I think not." He moved, faster than a human eye could follow. Her royal guard, finally regaining their wits, surged forward, but they were too slow. He was before her in an instant, close enough that she could feel the inferno of his body, could smell the scent of ash and brimstone clinging to him. He reached for her. Instinct took over. Her power, her only defense, lashed out. A wave of absolute zero erupted from her, a force that could freeze a man's heart in his chest. It struck him, and for a glorious, triumphant second, she saw frost climb his leather armor, saw his dark hair stiffen with ice, but it did not hold. The frost sizzled, turned to steam, and vanished. The Dragon Lord merely grunted, as if annoyed by a pesky insect. His hand, impossibly warm, closed around her bare arm. The contact was a cataclysm. A scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. It was not just pain, it was sensation. A violent, searing, overwhelming flood of feeling into a place that had been dead for a century. The heat of his skin against hers was an agony, a fire that licked up her arm, straight to her heart. It did not warm the ice. It threatened to shatter it. He paid her scream no mind. His grip was like iron. He pulled her from her throne, hauling her against his chest as if she weighed no more than a child. The heat of his body was everywhere, a suffocating, terrifying cage. She struggled, but it was like a snowflake fighting a bonfire. He turned, dragging her with him back towards the gaping maw of the ruined window. Her court watched, paralyzed with shock and fear. He was stealing their queen, their goddess of winter, from the very heart of her power. He paused at the edge, turning his head slightly, his lips close to her ear. His breath was a hot caress against her frozen skin. "Winter is over, Serene Valter," he growled, his voice a possessive promise meant only for her. And with those words, he leaped into the open air, her world of glacial silence shattering behind them. The fall was a silent scream trapped in her throat. For a horrifying instant, there was only the dizzying rush of air and the sight of her ice palace shrinking below, a pale blue jewel in a world of white. She was utterly untethered, a creature of absolute control, now subject to the savage whims of gravity. Her magic, a shield and sword for a century, was a useless, whimpering thing in the face of such raw, physical reality. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact that would shatter her like flawed glass. It never came. Instead, the inferno that held her erupted. The man, Kaelric, dissolved in a shockwave of heat that ripped the air apart. His form expanded, solidified, became a living mountain of obsidian and magma. Scales, hot as a forge, replaced the leather of his armor. A vast leathery wing, larger than a ship's sail, swept around her, cocooning her against a chest that was now a rumbling volcano. He had transformed back into his dragon shape, but he had not released her. He held her cradled against his throat, a fragile piece of ice protected by the very heart of the fire. The wind became a distant roar, shielded from her by his immense body. The cold of the upper altitudes, which should have been her domain, could not penetrate the suffocating aura of his heat. It was a prison of flesh and flame. She could feel the deep, rhythmic thrum of his heart, a slow, powerful beat that vibrated through her entire body. It was the sound of a living mountain, a force of nature that had claimed her. She risked a glance downward. Her kingdom, her pristine, orderly world of white and blue, was a receding map. The jagged peaks of the Frostfang Mountains, the shimmering expanse of the glacial sea. It all shrank until it was just a patch of white against the dark earth. He flew south. Every beat of his colossal wings carried them further from her power, from her throne, from the only life she had ever known. The journey was a blur of torment and revelation. The heat emanating from him was a constant, searing pain, a reminder of her own cursed numbness. Yet, beneath the agony, something else was stirring. A strange, terrifying awareness. Her skin, which had not truly felt anything but the echo of her own magic for 100 years, was now screaming with sensation. The rough texture of his scales, the vibration of his growls, the sheer oppressive warmth. It was a sensory onslaught that left her dizzy and nauseated. They flew for hours. The endless snows of Arendor gave way to the blighted gray wastes that formed the borderlands. A dead, cracked earth where nothing grew, a scar from ancient wars between their peoples. Then beyond that, the world began to change. The gray turned to brown, then to a startling, rusty red. The air grew thick with a haze that was not mist, but smoke. The scent of sulfur and ash filled her lungs, a smell she had only ever read about in forbidden texts. Mountains rose to meet them, but they were not the clean ice-capped spires of her home. These were jagged black peaks that smoked and fumed, their slopes streaked with angry red lines that glowed with sullen heat even in the daylight. He was taking her into the heart of his domain. The volcanic drifts, the land of the fireborn. Her captor angled his wings, and they began a sharp descent. He spiraled toward the largest of the volcanoes, a behemoth whose caldera was a cauldron of bubbling lava. Carved into its side was a fortress, not of elegant ice, but of black basaltic rock, stark and brutal. Windows glowed like malevolent orange eyes, and smoke plumed from high towers like the breath of a slumbering beast. This was his throne, the antithesis of her own. He landed on a massive stone ledge overlooking the caldera, the impact jarring her to the bone. The heat was immense. It rose from the rock beneath her feet, shimmered in the air, and beat down from the fiery sky above. For a moment she was too disoriented to move. Then, the cage of his wings and claws receded. The heat around him coalesced, shimmered, and Kaelric the man stood before her once more. He stood a few feet away, watching her, his ember eyes missing nothing. Her silver gown was singed at the hem. Her skin, where he had held her, was an angry red. She was shaking, but it was not from cold. It was the tremors of a body overwhelmed. A system in shock. "Welcome to the Ashen Peak, Queen Serene," he said, his voice laced with a dark, unreadable irony. Before she could form a reply, other figures emerged from a great stone archway behind them. They were dragons in human form, like him, all bearing the same fierce, predatory grace. They were clad in dark leathers and blackened steel, their eyes holding the same fiery glow. Their gazes fell upon her, a mixture of shock, suspicion, and raw hostility. "Kaelric!" One of them, a thick-necked brute with a scarred face, stepped forward. His eyes, the color of hot coals, raked over Serene with contempt. "What is this? You bring an ice witch into our sanctum, the Winter Queen herself?" "She is with me, Grak," Kaelric said, his tone flat and deadly, a clear warning. He took a half step, subtly placing himself more fully between Serene and the newcomer. Grak sneered, ignoring the warning. "With you? She is the source of the curse that bleeds our lands, the witch who freezes our borders and starves our allies. She is a trophy, warlord, or a prisoner to be broken. Let us show her what fireborn do with ice." He took a menacing step toward her, his hand moving to the hilt of a wicked-looking blade at his hip. Serene flinched back. Her magic, her only weapon, was a guttering candle in this inferno. She felt naked, vulnerable in a way that was more terrifying than the fall itself. She was a queen with no power, a sorceress with no spells, a woman surrounded by her oldest and most hated enemies. She did not see Kaelric move. One moment he was standing before her. The next he had Grak by the throat, slamming him against the rough-hewn stone wall with a sickening crunch. Kaelric's arm was a bar of steel, his fingers digging into the flesh of his subordinate's neck. His eyes were not embers now, they were blazing infernos. "She is not a trophy," Kaelric snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl that echoed off the stone. She is not a prisoner for you to touch, to taunt, or even to look at without my permission. She is mine. Do you understand me, Grak? You will show her the respect you show me, or I will melt that sword of yours and pour it down your throat." The air crackled with tension. Grak choked, his face purpling, his hands clawing uselessly at Kaelric's wrist. The other Fireborn warriors stood frozen, their shock now mingled with fear. They were watching their warlord, a being of immense power and brutal pragmatism, defend an enemy of their people with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Kaelric held him for a moment longer, letting the threat sink in, letting every warrior on that ledge understand the new order of things. Then he released him. Grak collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat. Kaelric turned his back on him, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He faced Serain again, his expression smoothing into that unreadable mask. But the heat of his rage still rolled off him in palpable waves. He had just protected her. Her captor, her enemy, the dragon who had stolen her from her throne, had just shielded her from his own kind. The contradiction was a physical blow, leaving her more breathless than Grak. Why, what game was he playing? This was not the act of a conqueror, it was the act of a protector. The thought was so alien, so impossible, that her mind rejected it. "Come," he said, his voice softer now, though still a command. He gestured toward the great stone archway. She hesitated, her feet feeling rooted to the spot. To follow him was to accept this new, terrifying reality. To step into the heart of his fiery mountain was to leave the last vestige of her old life behind. But what choice did she have? To remain here was to face the barely concealed hatred of his warriors. At least with him, there was a sliver of something. Not safety, but a focused danger she was beginning to understand was solely directed by him. She took a tentative step, then another, her silver slippers almost silent on the black stone. She walked past the humbled Grak, keeping her eyes forward, her queenly pride a thin, brittle armor around her. She followed Kaelric into the mountain. The interior of the Ashen Peak was a marvel of brutalist architecture. The corridors were vast, carved from the living rock of the volcano, and lit by veins of magma that flowed behind thick, crystalline plates in the walls. The air was hot and dry, thick with the smell of stone and fire. It was a place of immense raw power, so different from the elegant, silent beauty of her own palace. He led her through echoing halls and past guarded chambers, his warriors staring from the shadows as they passed. No one challenged them again. The message had been sent and received. She belonged to the warlord. Finally, they arrived at a pair of massive obsidian doors. He pushed them open, and they swung inward without a sound. He led her into his private chambers. The room was vast and surprisingly sparse. A huge bed covered in dark furs dominated one wall. A table was laden with maps and daggers, but the far wall was gone. It was an open archway, a balcony that offered a breathtaking and terrifying view of the molten caldera below. The room was heated by the very heart of the volcano. Kaelric walked to the table and poured water from a stone pitcher into a metal goblet. He held it out to her. She stared at it, then at him. "You are burned," he stated, his gaze falling to the angry red marks on her arm where his dragon scales had seared her. The words held no apology, merely an observation. She ignored the offered goblet and wrapped her other hand around her burned arm, a gesture of self-preservation. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse. "Why bring me here? Why protect me?" He set the goblet down and turned to face her fully. The fiery light from the caldera cast his scarred face in shifting shadows, making him look like some ancient predatory god. "Because your kingdom is dying, Serain," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Your eternal winter is a slow poison. You hold back the blight, yes, but you are killing the land. Your people starve. Your world is shrinking. It is a beautiful, frozen corpse." "It is my world to command," she shot back, a spark of her old fire returning. "And my people are safe." "Safe?" He gave a short, harsh laugh. "They are trapped, caged in ice, just as you are. You feel nothing, so you condemn them to a world without warmth, without life, without hope." His words struck a nerve she hadn't known was exposed. The whispers of Lord Vorlog, the pinched faces of her subjects, the traitorous thoughts in her own mind. She recoiled as if he had slapped her. "You know nothing of my curse. she whispered, the words tasting of ash. I know it was a lie, he said, his voice dropping, becoming intense, intimate. He took a step closer, and she stood her ground, refusing to retreat again. The gods did not curse you to never feel warmth. They cursed you to be unable to create it. You are a vessel for cold, an anchor for winter, but you are not immune to its opposite. He raised a hand, his eyes holding hers, daring her to look away. You felt my touch, Serene. The pain was real, which means something else can be real too. His fingers, calloused and impossibly hot, brushed against her cheek. She flinched, a gasp escaping her lips, but she did not pull away. The touch was still painful, a searing heat against her cold skin, but this time it was different. It was deliberate, gentle. Not the brutal grip of a captor, but a touch that was questioning, exploring. And beneath the pain, like a deep and resonant chord, was something else, a flicker, a ghost of sensation that was not agony. It was warmth. Her eyes widened, a storm of confusion and terror, and a dawning, impossible hope swirling within her. He saw it. He saw the crack in her glacial composure. A slow, triumphant smile touched his lips. He leaned closer, his voice a gravelly whisper that vibrated through the point of contact on her cheek, sending a tremor through her entire being. I did not steal you to destroy your kingdom, Ice Queen, he said, his ember eyes burning with a purpose she was only just beginning to comprehend. I stole you to save us both. Serene recoiled as if struck by lightning, her hand flying to her cheek. The skin he had touched was a nexus of impossible sensation. It burned, yes, a deep and searing pain that was 100 times more potent than the ambient heat of the room. But beneath the agony, woven through it like a thread of gold in a tapestry of fire, was that terrifying alien feeling. Warmth. It was a living thing, a pulse of energy that seemed to sink past her skin, past the muscle and bone, searching for the frozen, dormant thing in her chest. She stumbled back, her heel catching on the singed hem of her gown. She hit the hard edge of the map table, the impact jarring her, but even that solid, real sensation was muted, a distant echo compared to the phantom heat still blooming on her face. What magic is this? She hissed, her voice thin and ragged. What sorcery are you using to torment me? Kaelric watched her, his expression unreadable, his ember eyes tracking the storm of panic and disbelief that must have been plain on her face. He did not move closer, granting her a small circle of space in the suffocating heat of the chamber. It is not my magic, Queen, he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the black stone walls. It is yours, or rather, it is the void where your magic should be. I am simply filling it. Lies, she spat, though the word lacked conviction. Her entire body was testament to his truth. The very air she was breathing, thick and hot, was a constant reminder of how much she had never been able to feel. The curse. The curse is a cage of your own making, he interrupted, his tone hardening. Perhaps the gods forged the bars, but you have spent a century reinforcing them, polishing them, calling them a throne. You've hidden from the world in a fortress of your own numbness. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the open balcony, turning his profile to her. The molten light of the caldera below carved him into a silhouette of immense power and profound loneliness. My fire, he began, his gaze fixed on the roiling lava below, is a curse of its own. It is not the precise, controlled cold you wield. It is chaos, it is rage. It is a star trapped in a mortal body, and it longs to burn everything it touches. He clenched his hand into a fist, and for a fleeting second, tiny flames licked between his fingers before he forced them back into submission. I cannot touch my own people without immense control. I cannot hold a steel goblet without heating it to a brand. I sleep on stone because wood would turn to ash. Like you, I am isolated by the very power that defines me. Serene stared at his back, at the tension in his broad shoulders. She heard the frustration, the weariness in his voice, and it struck a chord of reluctant recognition within her. He spoke of a cage, and she, more than anyone, understood its confines. She had always imagined the Fireborn as masters of their element, reveling in its destructive glory. She had never considered that it might be a burden, a chain as heavy as her own. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice quiet, stripped of its queenly authority. He turned to face her, and the raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes, stole her breath. It was a burning agony, a desperate yearning that mirrored the inferno below them. Because there is a prophecy, an old one, hidden in the scorched texts of the first dragons. It does not speak of a war between fire and ice. It speaks of a union. It speaks of balance. He walked toward her again, his steps slow, deliberate, giving her time to retreat. She held her ground, her heart hammering a wild, painful rhythm against her ribs. The prophecy speaks of a warlord whose flame burns too hot, threatening to consume his world from within, he said, his voice dropping, becoming hypnotic. And it speaks of a queen whose heart is frozen so deep it starts to leach the life from her land. It says they are two halves of a fractured whole, that his fire can bring her warmth, and her ice can grant him peace, that together they can temper one another and forge a new world from the ashes of the old. He stopped, standing so close that the heat rolling off his body was a physical pressure. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "That is my bargain, Serene," he whispered, and her name on his lips was a brand. "I did not steal a queen to be my prisoner. I stole a partner to be my salvation. Help me control this fire that rages inside me. Let your cold temper my flame. In return, I will break the curse that binds you. I'll teach you to feel the sun, not as pain, but as a caress. I will melt the frost around your heart." The audacity of it, the sheer impossible scale of his proposal, left her speechless. He was not asking for her surrender. He was asking for her soul. He was offering her the one thing she had never dared to dream of, a cure, but the price was to bind herself to her greatest enemy, to the very element that was her antithesis. "You speak of partnership," she finally found her voice, lacing it with all the ice she could muster. "Yet you tore me from my home. You abducted me before my court. These are the actions of a conqueror, not an ally." "And would you have listened if I had sent an envoy?" he countered, his lips twisting into a wry, humorless smile. "Would the great and silent Ice Queen have deigned to receive a messenger of flame? Or would you have encased him in ice before he spoke a single word? I know your pride, Serene. I know your fear. I had to shatter your world to make you see the sky beyond it." His words were true, and that infuriated her more than any lie could. She would have rejected any offer, seen it as a trick, a prelude to invasion. Her isolation was her shield. She would never have lowered it willingly. He had not given her a choice. A heavy silence fell between them, filled only by the deep, guttural breathing of the volcano. She looked around the chamber, at the brutal stone, the glowing veins of magma, the furs on the bed that probably came from beasts she had never seen. This was her reality now. A cage of fire, with a warden who claimed he wanted to set her free. Her gaze fell to the table, to the metal goblet of water he had offered her earlier. Her throat was parched. Her lips cracked from the dry heat. Without thinking, she reached out and picked it up. It was cool against her fingers, the metal having dissipated the initial heat of his touch. She drank, the water a blessed relief, a small piece of normalcy in a world turned upside down. He watched the simple act, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "The choice is yours," he said, his voice losing its hard edge. "You can remain here, in this chamber, my honored guest, or you can accept my bargain. We can begin to heal each other, and our lands." He gestured to the open balcony. "But do not take too long to decide. There is a reason I acted now. A blight is growing in the borderlands, a rot born from the extreme imbalance of our magics. It feeds on unchecked frost and uncontrolled fire. It will not stop at the wastes. Soon, it will be strong enough to consume both the ashen peak and the glacial spire. Your winter cannot stop it, and my fire only makes it grow faster. Our stalemate is about to become our mutual annihilation." With that dire pronouncement, he turned and walked to the obsidian doors. "I will have food and clothing sent to you. You are not a prisoner, but you are my guest. No one will harm you here. I have made that clear." His hand rested on the door. He looked back at her, his fiery eyes seeming to strip away every layer of her defense. "Think on my offer, Serene. Think of what it is to feel the sun." The doors closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving her alone in the vast, hot chamber. She was alone, but the room was not empty. It was filled with his presence, his scent of ash and ozone, the lingering echo of his voice. She walked on trembling legs to the balcony, her hands gripping the stone railing. The rock was warm beneath her palms, a constant, pervasive heat that was slowly seeping into her. Below, the lake of lava churned and bubbled, a chaotic dance of creation and destruction. It was terrifying. It was mesmerizing. It was everything her world was not. Her world was silent, still, predictable, and sterile. This place was loud, violent, and bursting with a terrible, untamed life. She thought of her kingdom, of the perfect, silent fields of snow, the glittering spires of her palace. It was beautiful. It was hers. And it was, as he had said, a corpse, a beautiful, frozen corpse. He offered her a thaw, a chance to feel, to live, to break the curse that had defined her existence. But it would mean trusting him, trusting the dragon. It would mean weaving her magic, her very essence with his, an act of such profound intimacy that it terrified her more than any battle. It would mean becoming vulnerable, not just to him, but to the world she had hidden from for so long. She raised a hand to her cheek, where the ghost of his touch still lingered. It was a promise and a threat, a key and a brand. He spoke of saving them both. She feared it was simply a more beautiful way to burn. The choice was hers, he'd said. But as she stared into the fiery heart of his world, she knew it was no choice at all. It was destiny, arriving with the roar of a dragon and the scent of ash, to either save her or consume her completely. Left in the echoing silence of the chamber, Serene felt the last of her queenly composure crumble. She was adrift in a sea of fire, her certainties turned to ash. She sank onto a stone bench near the balcony, her body trembling with a violent, unfamiliar energy. The heat was a constant pressure, a relentless reminder of her vulnerability. Her skin, accustomed to a world where the air itself was a shield, now felt raw and exposed, every nerve ending screaming in protest. Hours passed. The lava in the caldera below shifted and flowed, its patterns ever-changing, a liquid heart for a world of stone. It was the only clock in this timeless, fiery prison. She watched it, her mind a maelstrom of his words. A cage of your own making. A flame that has been frozen. I stole you to save us both. They were the words of a madman or a messiah. And she did not know which was more dangerous. As twilight painted the smoky sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, the obsidian doors opened. It was not Kaelric. A woman entered, tall and lean, with hair the color of cooling embers braided down her back. Her eyes were the same molten gold as the others, but hers held a sharp, assessing intelligence rather than overt hostility. She carried a bundle of dark cloth and a tray laden with food. She moved with the silent grace of a predator, setting the tray on the table without a word. The warlord commanded you be given sustenance and a change of clothes, the woman said, her voice low and carefully neutral. She unfolded the garments, a tunic of dark, breathable linen, sturdy leather trousers, and soft boots. They were practical, severe, and utterly alien. Serene looked from the simple clothes to her own ruined gown. The silver silk, woven with frost magic, was limp and singed, its power deadened in this oppressive heat. It was a relic of a life that felt a lifetime away. My name is Lyra, the woman offered, her gaze unwavering. I am Kaelric's second. He has entrusted me with your well-being. The word entrusted was spoken with a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation, as if she were tasting a poison. It was clear she viewed this task as a burden, if not a betrayal. Does the warlord's entire clan approve of him bringing an enemy into their heart? Serene asked, her own voice sounding foreign in her ears, stripped of its usual Arctic command. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Lyra's face. Kaelric's command is absolute. His reasons are his own. We trust his strength, if not always his impulses. She gave a pointed look at Serene. The food is from the lower kitchens, spiced but nourishing. You should eat. This mountain is not kind to the weak. With that, she gave a curt nod and was gone, the doors closing behind her with a soft finality. Serene was alone again with the offerings of her new life. She approached the table and looked at the food. There were roasted meats that smelled of unfamiliar herbs, dark bread that was still warm, and fruits she did not recognize, their colors vibrant and exotic. Tentatively, she took a piece of the bread. The taste was a shock. earthy, rich, and alive. It was not like the delicate, flavorless fare of her frozen court. This food had been grown under a real sun. She ate, forcing herself to build a strength that was not magical. Then she shed the ruined remnants of her identity. The silver gown pooled on the floor, a ghost of the queen she had been. She dressed in the fire-born clothes. The rough linen chafed her skin, and the leather felt heavy and confining. But there was an honesty to them. They were clothes meant for survival, not for display. She caught her reflection in the polished surface of the obsidian doors, a pale wraith in a land of shadow and fire. Her white blonde hair was a stark banner of defiance against the dark tunic. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, looked haunted. And on her cheek, a faint red mark remained, the phantom touch of the dragon who had brought her here. She touched it, and the memory of that agonizing, revelatory warmth shot through her. He was right. She had felt it. After a century of nothing, she had felt something. And in that moment, staring at the ghost in the stone, a cold, hard resolve solidified in her heart. She could stay in this room, a pampered prisoner, and wait for the blight to consume both their worlds. She could wither away in this heat, a relic of a dying age, or she could seize the terrifying, impossible bargain he had offered. She could learn to feel the sun, even if it burned her to ashes. The silence of her past was a tomb. The fire of his future was a risk, but it was at least a future. When Calric returned, she was waiting for him on the balcony, her back to the caldera, her face set in a mask of grim determination. He stopped just inside the chamber, his fiery eyes taking in the sight of her. Dressed in the clothes of his people, she looked less like a captive queen and more like a warrior preparing for a battle she was not sure she could win. "You have made your decision," he stated. It was not a question. "I have," she said, her voice steady. "I accept your bargain, Dragon Lord." A current of energy seemed to pass through the room. The air grew thicker, heavier. He walked toward her, his presence an overwhelming force of heat and power. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the inferno of his body, could see the tiny flecks of gold dancing in his ember eyes. "This will not be easy, Serene," he warned, his voice a low growl. "Your magic will fight this. Your very nature will see my fire as a threat to be extinguished. You must not fight. You must yield. You must invite the warmth in." "And you," she countered, lifting her chin, "can you control the inferno you offer? Or will you simply incinerate me and call it a cure?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That is the other half of the bargain, isn't it? You must trust me not to burn you, and I must trust you not to freeze me from the inside out." He raised his hand, palm up, an offering and a challenge. "The first step is the hardest. It requires contact, willingly given, willingly received." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of ice. This was it, the precipice. She looked at his hand. It was large, calloused, scarred from 100 battles. Veins of faint red light seemed to pulse just beneath the skin. It was the hand of a killer, a warlord, and it was the only hand in the world that could offer her salvation. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the hot air searing her lungs. Then, slowly, deliberately, she raised her own hand and placed it in his. Pain, white-hot and absolute. A scream built in her throat, but she choked it down. It was 1,000 times worse than his first touch, because this time she was not fighting it. She was opening a door, and his fire was rushing in like a flood. It was a torment that lit up every nerve, a fire that threatened to turn her blood to steam. Her first instinct was to unleash her cold, to build a wall of ice around her heart and hurl a blizzard at him. "Don't fight it," Kelric's voice cut through the haze of her agony, his tone tight with his own strain. His grip on her hand was firm, an anchor in the storm. "Breathe, Serene. Feel it. Don't just endure it, accept it." She forced her eyes open. He was watching her, his jaw clenched. Sweat beaded on his brow, a sign of the immense control he was exerting. He was holding back the ocean of his power, allowing only a single searing river to flow into her. He was trusting her. She closed her eyes again and focused on the pain, not as an enemy, but as a sensation. She let it wash over her, and beneath the screaming, burning surface, she felt it again. That deep, liquid pulse of pure warmth. This time it was stronger, clearer. It was not just a flicker. It was a steady, golden current flowing from him to her. It bypassed her skin and sank deeper, seeking the frozen core of her. Her magic, the ancient, silent cold, that was her very essence, stirred in response. It rose to meet the fire, not with aggression, but with a strange instinctual curiosity. It was like a winter stream meeting a geothermal vent. Instead of a violent explosion, there was a hissing, a steaming, a blending. Her cold, which had always been a weapon of absolute stillness, wrapped around his chaotic, raging fire. It did not extinguish it. It soothed it. It gave it shape, tempered its destructive edges, and calmed the inferno into a manageable, focused heat. A deep groan escaped Calric's lips, a sound of profound, unexpected relief. The tension in his shoulders eased, and the fierce light in his eyes softened. By the first flame, he breathed, his gaze locked on their joined hands. It's quiet. For the first time in his life, the constant, roaring forge inside him was not a threat. It was a hearth. For the first time in her life, the absolute zero of her soul was not a void. It was a vessel being filled. The pain in her arm subsided, replaced by a vibrant, humming energy that made her feel more alive than she had in a century. It was not just warmth. It was life itself, a symphony of sensation in a body that had only known silence. The air around them changed. The sharp metallic scent of his ozone and ash mingled with a fragrance she had never been able to perceive before, the scent of her own magic, the clean, crisp, cold perfume of falling snow on ancient stone. The two scents entwined, creating something new and intoxicating. The smell of a thunderstorm breaking over a cooling volcano, of cinder and snow, of fire and ice finding a perfect, impossible harmony. The connection deepened, a bond of raw magic forging between them. More intimate than any physical touch. It pulled them under, and for a heart-stopping second, the world fell away. They saw not with their eyes, but with their shared senses. They saw a blasted gray landscape under a sick sky. They saw skeletal trees weeping a viscous black tar that sizzled where it touched the ground, and the earth itself was split with corrupted fissures that pulsed with a malevolent purple light. The blight. It was not just a creeping decay, it was a sentient hunger, a conscious rot born of their elemental war. It was waking up. The vision was so potent, so full of despair and ancient evil, that it shattered their fragile control. The bond broke. They were flung apart, stumbling back from each other as if physically struck. Serene gasped for air, her hand flying to her chest, where her heart was pounding with a wild new rhythm. Calric braced himself against the balcony railing, his breathing harsh. He stared at her, his usual mask of command shattered, his ember eyes wide with a raw, stunning emotion that went far beyond strategy or prophecy. It was awe. It was shock. It was a terrifying, profound recognition. "The prophecy," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. He looked down at his own hand, then back to her face, as if seeing her for the very first time. It spoke of balance, of tempering the elements. He took a step toward her, his eyes burning with a new, unguarded intensity. "It never said it would feel like that. It's not just our magic, Serene." He stopped, his gaze holding hers captive, sealing them in a bubble of silent, shocking revelation. "It's us." The word hung in the superheated air between them, more potent than any spell. Us. It was a claim, a chain, a key, and Serene did not know which terrified her more. She jerked her hand back from his, as if his skin had become molten lava, a desperate, instinctual retreat into the safety of isolation. The vibrant, humming connection between them snapped, leaving a void that was colder than any winter she had ever commanded. The pain of its absence was a new and terrible agony. "No," she whispered, the word a ragged shard of ice in the furnace of the room. She backed away, her hands clutching her own arms, trying to contain the storm that was raging inside her. Sensation was a flood, and she was drowning in it. The warmth, the pain, the terrifying vision of the blight, the echo of his mind brushing against hers. It was too much. "It is a trick of the magic, a consequence of the prophecy, nothing more." Calric watched her, his face a mask of granite, but his eyes were blazing furnaces of emotion he could no longer conceal. The awe, the shock. It was all there, raw and unguarded. He had felt it too, the quiet, the rightness of it. You felt it, Serene, he said, his voice low and intense, closing the distance she tried to create. You felt my fire settle. You felt the storm in me find its center. That was not a consequence. That was resonance. I felt my power being corrupted by yours, she shot back, her voice shaking with a fury born of fear. I will be a partner in this, Dragon Lord. I will uphold the bargain to save my kingdom, but do not mistake a necessary alliance for anything else. Before he could reply, the obsidian doors to the chamber swung open with force. Lyra stood there, her face grim, her usual composure fractured by urgency. Warlord, she said, her molten gaze flicking to Serene for a half-second before locking back on Kelric. There is a disturbance at the northern ward. A magical sending from Arendor. It breached the outer defenses before it was contained. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through the chaos of Serene's newfound emotions. Ascending from her kingdom. It could only be a message of war or a desperate plea. Kelric's focus snapped instantly to his second. The raw emotion on his face was shuddered away, replaced by the warlord of the Ashen Peak. Show me. He strode from the room without a backward glance, but the command was implicit. Follow. Serene hesitated for only a heartbeat. Her kingdom. Her responsibility. She hurried after him, Lyra falling into step just behind, a silent, watchful shadow. They moved through the volcanic fortress, down corridors carved from cooling lava, to a vast, circular chamber at the mountain's heart. This was the strategic core of the Ashen Peak. A war room Kelric called the Obsidian Hearth. A massive circular table of polished black stone dominated the center, its surface carved with a map of the known world. Kelric's warriors, including the hostile Grak, were already assembled, their faces etched with suspicion as they saw her enter behind their leader. In the center of the room, hovering above the map table, was a shimmering sphere of captured magic. It was a globe of swirling, milky white energy laced with veins of frosty blue. It radiated a palpable cold that made the air around it hiss and steam. It was her magic. Arendorian magic. It carries a voice and an image, Grak growled, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. But it is shielded. It will only open for one of her blood. His eyes narrowed at Serene, accusation and hatred warring in his gaze. Or it is a trap, a Trojan horse made of ice, meant to freeze this mountain from the inside out. If it were a weapon, Grak, it would have been sprung already, Kelric said, his voice silencing all dissent. His attention, however, was on Serene. He saw the recognition in her eyes, the fear. This is your magic. Can you open it safely? She walked toward the floating sphere, ignoring the hostile stares of the fireborn warriors. The cold emanating from the globe was a balm to her overstimulated senses, a whisper of home in this alien land. She could feel the intricate weave of the spellwork, the signature of the caster. Her stomach tightened into a knot of ice. I know this magic, she said softly. It belongs to Lord Vorlog. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly. The moment her skin touched the surface of the sphere, it dissolved. The swirling mist coalesced, rising from the table to form a life-sized effigy of the man himself. Lord Vorlog stood before them, his image crafted from shimmering frost and captured light. He was dressed not in the furs of the court, but in black armor inlaid with silver, a sword at his hip. He looked harder, colder, his eyes gleaming with a triumph that made Serene's blood run cold. His spectral gaze swept the room, disdainfully passing over the fireborn warriors, before landing on Serene. A cruel, satisfied smile touched his lips. So the rumors are true, his voice echoed, a sound of grinding ice. Our queen did not perish. She fled into the arms of our most ancient enemy, a traitor, a whore to the flame. A collective snarl rose from the assembled dragons. Grak took a half-step forward, his hand clenching, but Kelric raised a single finger, and the room fell silent. He stood beside Serene, a pillar of heat and silent fury, his presence a shield. Serene's own rage was a white-hot spike in her chest, so potent it was nauseating. It was a new sensation, this burning fury, and it threatened to consume her. You dare speak of treason, Vorlog? You who have whispered dissent in every shadow of my palace. Whispers are for cowards, your grace, Vorlog sneered, the title a mockery. I act. While you were content to let Arendor slowly starve in its perfect frozen prison, I sought a true solution. I have taken your throne. The council has declared you an enemy of the state. Your magic forfeit. Your name erased. Arendor has a new king. The words were a physical blow. Her throne, her council, her people, gone. A century of rule, of sacrifice, of lonely duty, wiped away in a matter of days. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a terrifying moment, the oppressive heat of the room seemed to rush in, threatening to suffocate her. She felt Kaelric shift beside her, a subtle movement of support, and it was enough to keep her upright. My people will never accept you, she managed to say, her voice tight. They are loyal to the Valter line. Vorlog laughed, a harsh, grating sound. The people are loyal to their survival, and I have offered them something you never would. Warmth. He raised a hand, and the frost effigy shifted. Behind him, an image of her throne room materialized. It was changed. The glacial spire, her throne of pure ice, was weeping, melting into a misshapen lump, and at its base, ugly purplish crystals grew like a cancer, pulsing with a sick, necrotic light. The same light she and Kaelric had seen in their vision of the blight. What have you done? She breathed, horror choking her. I have made a pact with a power that understands growth, not stagnation, Vorlog declared, his eyes burning with fanaticism. An ancient power that slumbers in the borderlands. It offers us strength, a way to fight back against the flames of the south without succumbing to them. It will devour the blight and grant us a new kind of life. It requires only that we give it a foothold. Your frozen kingdom is the perfect vessel. He was feeding the blight. He was inviting the sentient rot into the heart of her kingdom, believing it to be a controllable ally. The fool. He was not making a pact. He was presiding over an execution. You will destroy us all, she whispered. No, Vorlog corrected, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. You will. The warlord stole you for the prophecy, did he not? He seeks to unite your ice with his fire, but this new power has told me the truth. The union of fire and ice will not bring balance. It will create a cataclysm that will scour the world clean. It will be the blight's final victory. I am saving our world from you, Serain. His image flickered. This is a declaration. Arendor is now the dominion of the thriving winter. Stay with your dragon lover. If you ever set foot in your homeland again, you will be executed as a traitor. The frost effigy exploded into a million shards of fading light, and the chamber was plunged back into a tense, heated silence. Every eye was on her. The suspicion, the hatred, it was all there. Vorlog's words had been a poisoned dart, perfectly aimed. He had not just announced his treason, he had branded her a traitor, and Kaelric a fool who was bringing about the apocalypse. She stood frozen, the foundations of her world swept away. She had no home, no throne, no people. She was an exile, her name cursed in the very kingdom she had given her life to protect. The rage she had felt moments before was gone, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness that was colder than any ice she had ever known. A century of numbness had been a shield against this very feeling, this utter, soul-crushing despair. Her instinct, her deepest impulse, was to retreat, to find that numbness again, to rebuild the walls of her glacial silence and hide within them forever. She turned, her movements stiff and robotic, and walked from the war room. She did not see the looks on the warriors' faces, did not hear the low growl that rumbled in Kaelric's chest. She walked back to the chamber he had given her, the cage that was now her only refuge in the world. She went to the balcony and stared into the caldera, but she did not see the fire. She saw her melting throne, the weeping ice, the cancerous purple crystals. She saw her people, their faces pinched and pale, now bowing to a madman who was leading them to ruin. Everything she had sacrificed for, everything she had suffered for, was being undone. The obsidian doors opened and closed. She knew it was him without looking. His presence was a sun at her back, a pressure of heat and life in her world of encroaching death. Leave me, she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. It was the flat, dead voice of the Winter Queen. No, Kaelric said. He came to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that his heat was a tangible thing. He is a fool, Serain, a traitor who has made a pact with the world's end because he was too weak to lead. He has my throne, she whispered to the fire. He has my kingdom. I have nothing. You have your magic, he countered, his voice a low, fierce rumble. You have your name, and you have me. She flinched at the last words, turning to face him, her eyes blazing with a cold, desperate fury. You are the cause of this. If you had not stolen me, I would still be on my throne. Vorlog would still be a coward whispering in the dark. My kingdom would be safe. Your kingdom was dying, he roared, his own control snapping. The air around them shimmered with heat. It would have fallen to the blight with or without Vorlog's help. You were just presiding over a slower death. I did not take your kingdom from you, Serene. I gave you a chance to save it. His words struck her, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. This was the culmination of her own failure, her own static, silent rule. Vorlog had simply been the maggot to find the rot. The fight went out of her, leaving her utterly spent. A single crystalline tear, the first she had shed in 100 years, traced a path down her cheek. It did not freeze. In the heat of his presence, it remained liquid, a drop of pure, undiluted sorrow. It fell from her chin and hissed as it struck the hot stone of the balcony. Kaelric's expression softened, the inferno in his eyes banking into a steady, protective glow. He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate. He gently took her arm, the one that was not burned, his touch a careful, controlled warmth. This time it did not sear. It anchored her. He took your throne, Kaelric said, his voice dropping to a vow. He branded you a traitor. He is poisoning your home. His thumb stroked her arm, a small grounding circle of warmth. Let him sit on that melting chair and call himself a king. He leaned closer, his fiery gaze locking with her icy one. And in that moment, she did not see a dragon lord or a warlord. She saw an ally, a partner. He was the only one in the world who understood the cage she had lived in, and the only one who had ever dared to break it. A queen's power is not in her throne, he murmured, his voice a promise of fire and retribution. It is in her return. The days that followed were forged in the crucible of their shared purpose. The grief for her lost kingdom did not vanish, but it crystallized within Serene, hardening from a crippling despair into a diamond-sharp resolve. Kaelric's words echoed in the chambers of her heart. A queen's power is not in her throne, it is in her return. She was no longer just a captive or a guest. She was an ally, a general, a queen in exile preparing for the war to reclaim her world. The obsidian hearth became their sanctum. Kaelric's warriors, even the surly Grok, watched with grudging respect as the Ice Queen transformed before their eyes. She stood beside their warlord at the great map table, her mind as keen and precise as a shard of ice, dissecting Vorlog's strategy, predicting the spread of the blight, and identifying weaknesses in Arendor's defenses that only she could know. She was not a fireborn, but she had the cold, calculating heart of a master tactician, a perfect foil to Kaelric's passionate, aggressive command. Their training began in earnest, a dangerous and intimate dance of elemental forces. They returned to the balcony overlooking the caldera, the site of their first connection, and learned to wield their joined power. It was a battle of wills, a storm of instinct and control. The first time they joined hands again, the surge of power was just as agonizing, just as overwhelming. Her body screamed for the familiar numbness of her cold. His instincts roared to unleash the full, cleansing inferno of his fire. Focus on me, Kaelric's voice would ground her, a low rumble through the chaos. Don't fight the heat. Guide it. Give my fire your focus. Give it a target. And she would try. Closing her eyes, she would visualize a single point, a distant, icy peak in her mind. She would pull his chaotic, explosive energy, letting it flow through the conduit of her body and funnel it through the lens of her own precise magic. The first few attempts were disastrous. A blast of unfocused heat melted a patch of the stone floor. A wave of uncontrolled cold sent a plume of frozen steam erupting toward the sky. But slowly, painstakingly, they found their rhythm. She learned to accept the searing warmth, to let it fill the frozen voids within her without being consumed. The constant pain of his presence softened, transforming into a vibrant, life-giving heat that seemed to thaw muscles she hadn't known were frozen, to stir a sluggish heart to a stronger, steadier beat. She was beginning to feel not just pain and warmth, but a spectrum of sensation, the texture of the stone under her fingers, the taste of the spiced food, the scent of cinder and snow that now clung to them both. It was a symphony awakening in a world that had been silent for a century. And Kaelric found a peace he had never known. Her cold did not diminish his fire. It gave it form. It was the banks to his raging river, the vessel that could contain his molten core. He could unleash a torrent of flame, but with her magic wrapped around it, it would not be a wild conflagration. It would be a focused spear of pure, controlled energy. He could touch her now, a brief, careful brush of his hand against hers, without the immense, bone-wearying strain of holding his inferno in check. Her presence was a balm to the constant storm within him. Their growing magical attunement bled into every other aspect of their existence. They would spend hours in the war room, their heads bent close over the map, his hand gesturing with fiery certainty, hers tracing a path of cold logic. They ate their meals together, speaking of histories and curses, of the prophecies that had defined them and the choices that would now remake them. He told her of the brutal honor of the dragon clans, of a life spent taming a power that longed for destruction. She told him of the profound loneliness of her glacial throne, of the silent, suffocating weight of a duty that had stolen her very humanity. One evening, as they stood on the balcony, the volcanic glow painting their faces in shades of fire and shadow, she found herself confessing her deepest fear. "He called me a whore to the flame," she said softly, her gaze on the churning lava. "And a part of me fears he is right, that in accepting this warmth, I am betraying everything I was, everything I stood for." Kaelric was silent for a long moment. He did not offer easy comforts or false reassurances. When he spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly caress. "You stood for the preservation of your people, Serene. You locked your kingdom in ice to protect them. You were willing to live in a frozen hell to keep them safe. Now you are willing to walk through fire to do the same. You have not betrayed your purpose. You have simply changed your weapon." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was no longer painful, but a shocking, tender heat that sent a tremor through her. There is more honor in the queen who walks through fire than the one who hides behind a wall of ice. His thumb brushed against her lower lip, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air between them crackled, not just with magic, but with a tension that was far more ancient, far more primal. His ember eyes were not just looking at her, they were devouring her. He saw not the Ice Queen, not the military strategist, but the woman beneath, the flame he had sworn to uncover. And she, in turn, saw past the warlord, past the dragon. She saw the scarred, burdened man who found peace only in her presence, the soul whose raging fire was calmed by her touch. He leaned in, his intent clear, his gaze locked on her lips. Her heart hammered a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was a line she had never imagined crossing, a union of a different, more terrifying kind. Her mind screamed at her to retreat, to raise her icy shields, but her body betrayed her. It swayed toward him, craving the very heat it had once feared above all else. Before his lips could meet hers, a deafening alarm, a deep, resonant clang of dragon-forged bronze, echoed up from the heart of the mountain. The moment shattered. Kaelric straightened, the raw want in his eyes instantly banked by the cold steel of command. Grak appeared in the doorway, his face a grim mask. "Warlord, the Blight," he said, his voice strained. "It's moving, faster than we predicted. It has crossed the borderlands. It is consuming the southern farmlands of Arendor. Vorlog is not containing it. He's feeding it." The war had come. Within the hour, the Ashen Peak was a hive of activity. Warriors strapped on armor, sharpened blades, and prepared for flight. The plan was simple, brutal, and hinged entirely on the union of their two powers. Kaelric would lead a small, elite force of his strongest warriors. They would fly north, not to assault the glacial spire directly, but to strike at the heart of the Blight's power, a nexus of corruption that Serene had identified from ancient maps. A place known as the Weeping Glade. Their goal was not to defeat Vorlog's army, but to sever his connection to the dark power he had unleashed. If they could cleanse the nexus, the Blight's influence over Arendor would wither. As Kaelric stood on the great landing ledge, preparing to shift into his dragon form, Serene approached him. She was dressed in the dark, practical leathers of the Fireborn. her white blonde hair braided tightly back. She looked every inch the warrior queen. "I am going with you," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Grak, standing nearby, scoffed. "This is a battle for dragons, witch, not a place for fragile things." Serene ignored him, her eyes locked on Kelric. "I know the land. I know the magic. My cold is the only thing that can shield you from the Blight's necrotic energies long enough for you to strike. You need me." Kelric looked at her, his expression unreadable. He saw the fire in her winter sky eyes, the unshakable resolve. She was right. This was their fight, together. But to take her into the heart of that corruption, it is too dangerous, he said, the words torn from him. "Living is dangerous," she countered, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I have spent a century avoiding it. I will not start again now." He held her gaze for a beat longer, a silent war of wills passing between them. Then he gave a curt, sharp nod. The decision was made. He began to transform, his body expanding in a wave of incandescent heat. As the colossal dragon took shape, he lowered a massive wing, creating a ramp. "Stay close to me," his voice rumbled in her mind, a telepathic command that was a side effect of their deepening bond. "Cling to my back. My fire will be your shield." She climbed onto his back, settling between the great obsidian spines at the base of his neck. His scales were a familiar, vibrant heat against her skin. She wrapped her hands around the base of a spine, anchoring herself. Below her, the other dragons took flight, a fearsome vanguard of fire and shadow. With a powerful beat of his wings, Kelric launched them into the smoky sky, turning north toward home. The flight was a grim passage. The land below was a testament to the Blight's ravenous hunger. The verdant forests that bordered the volcanic plains were reduced to skeletal, black husks. The earth itself was cracked and oozing a viscous, purple poison. As they crossed into the borders of Arendor, the sight was even more horrific. The pristine snow was not melting. It was being consumed, turned into a black, corrupted slush that pulsed with a sickening, unholy light. They reached the weeping glade as the last rays of a dying sun painted the corrupted sky. It was a crater of pure wrongness in the world. At its center stood a pulsating monument of black crystalline wrought, a physical manifestation of the Blight's heart. Vorlog was there, standing before it as if at an altar, his arms raised. He was not commanding it. He was worshipping it, channeling the life force of the land, of Arendor itself, into the crystalline heart. "He's completing the ritual," Serene's voice was a shard of ice in Kelric's mind. "If that crystal reaches its full power, the Blight will be anchored to our world forever." Kelric let out a roar that shook the very mountains, a challenge and a declaration of war. He dove. The other dragons followed, peeling off to engage Vorlog's corrupted guard, former knights of Arendor, whose armor was now twisted with purple growths. Kelric ignored them, his focus and Serene's entirely on the Nexus. As they neared, a wave of pure necrotic energy, a visible ripple of purple and black, erupted from the crystal, aimed directly at them. "Now, Serene, Serene!" Kelric roared in her mind. She closed her eyes, not against the sight, but to focus her will. She reached for the cold within her, the absolute zero that was her birthright. But this time, she did not wield it alone. She opened the conduit between herself and Kelric. His fire, a boundless ocean of it, poured into her. She did not flinch from the searing agony. She embraced it, shaped it with her will, and wrapped it in a shell of her own purest frost. She thrust her hands forward. A beam of energy, a phenomenon that should not exist, shot from her hands. It was a torrent of pure white light, shimmering with an inner fire, yet edged with the crystalline sharpness of absolute zero. It was the perfect union of their souls. It struck the Blight's attack head-on. There was no explosion. The two forces annihilated each other in a silent, violent implosion that tore a hole in reality for a brief, terrifying instant. Vorlog screamed in fury, turning his attention to the dragon descending from the sky. He thrust his hands at the crystal, drawing on its power. A spear of black energy shot toward them. Kelric twisted in the air, a movement of impossible grace for a creature his size, and took the blow on his wing. He roared in pain as the Blight's magic ate at his scales, but he did not falter. He landed with an earth-shattering crash, shielding Serene with his body, as he slid to a halt before the corrupted nexus. He lowered his head, allowing her to slide to the ground. She stood before her betrayer, the snow turned slush hissing around her boots. Kaelric stood behind her, a mountain of protective fury, his wounded wing weeping smoke. "It is over, Vorlog," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the heart of a glacier. "It is just beginning, traitor," he snarled, his face twisted into a mask of madness. He drew his sword, its blade glowing with the same purple corruption. "Your dragon will die, and you will kneel before the new god of this world," he charged. But he was not charging at her. He was charging at Kaelric, his corrupted blade aimed at the dragon's exposed, softer underbelly. It was an attack born of desperation and insanity. Kaelric could have incinerated him with a single breath. But he was wounded, and the move was suicidally fast. Serain reacted on pure instinct. She did not think. She felt. She stepped directly into Vorlog's path, not with a weapon of ice, not with a shield of magic. She met him with the fire that now lived inside her. She caught his sword arm, her hand closing around his armored wrist. Vorlog screamed. It was not a sound of rage, but of pure, unadulterated agony. The point of contact, where her skin met his armor, glowed with a blinding white heat. His enchanted steel, meant to withstand a dragon's fire, melted like wax. The blight's corruption sizzled and burned away, unable to exist in the presence of such pure, focused energy. She held him, her winter sky eyes boring into his, showing him the truth of the power he had rejected. She was not just the queen of ice anymore. She was the vessel for a fire that could unmake the world. She was the union of two thrones, and this was her return. Vorlog's scream was the sound of a soul being unmade. The pure, unified magic pouring from Serain's hand was anathema to the blight's corruption. It was not just fire, not just ice, but a sublime and terrible fusion that was the very essence of life itself. The purple energy clinging to Vorlog's armor, and his blade dissolved like smoke in a hurricane. His sword melted, dripping in molten, hissing slag onto the corrupted slush at his feet. His armor, once the pride of an Arendorian lord, glowed white-hot before crumbling into blackened dust. He collapsed, his connection to the blight's power severed so violently that he was left a hollowed-out shell. He stared up at her, his eyes wide with a madness born of utter defeat, seeing not the traitor he had named, but the living embodiment of the prophecy he had tried to twist to his own ends. Serain released him. She did not need to strike him down. She had already scoured him clean of his stolen power, leaving him as nothing more than a man, shivering and broken in the unnatural twilight. Behind her, Kaelric let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of profound, vibrating awe. He had lent her his fire, but the power she had just wielded was something more. It was her own. "The Nexus," she said, her voice clear and ringing with an authority she had never possessed before. It was not the cold command of the Winter Queen, but the vibrant call of a ruler who had embraced her full power. She turned to the pulsating, crystalline heart of the blight. Kaelric moved to her side, his massive form a wall of obsidian and living flame. His wounded wing was already beginning to heal, the corrupted flesh flaking away to reveal new, healthy scales underneath. He needed no words, no command. He knew what they had to do. She placed her hand on his side, against the hot, solid scales just below his shoulder. He lowered his head until his fiery gaze was level with hers. They were a single unit, a union of two thrones made manifest. "Together," he rumbled in her mind. "Together," she answered, both aloud and in his thoughts. She closed her eyes, and he did the same. She reached for the endless winter within her soul, and he for the ceaseless star in his chest. They did not just touch the magic. They became it. The air around them grew still and silent. Then from Serain, a beam of purest diamond frost erupted. From Kaelric, a torrent of liquid golden flame. The two beams did not just travel side by side. They spiraled around each other, weaving together into a double helix of impossible energy. The combined force struck the blight's crystal heart. For a moment, there was no sound. The world seemed to hold its breath. The black crystal absorbed the energy, glowing with a violent internal light. It tried to fight back, to corrupt the magic, but it could not. The union of fire and ice was not a conflict it could feed on. It was a perfect, harmonious judgment. With a sound that was both a crystalline chime and a volcanic roar, the nexus shattered. It did not explode. It sublimated, turning from a solid monument of rot into a cloud of inert gray dust that was scattered by a wind that was suddenly, miraculously clean. A wave of cleansing energy rolled out from the spot where the crystal had stood. The sickly purple light in the ground flickered and died. The black, oily slush hissed and began to clarify, the corruption burning away to leave behind pure, clean water. The skeletal trees stood for a moment longer, then collapsed into piles of sterile ash. The land, though scarred and barren, was no longer poisoned. It was merely empty, waiting. The battle was over. Vorlog's blighted knights, their source of power gone, fell to their knees, disoriented and weak, and were quickly subdued by Kelric's warriors. Grok stood over the kneeling form of Vorlog, his sword at the man's throat, and looked to Serain for the order. She walked forward, her boots splashing in the newly formed puddles. She looked down at the man who had stolen her throne and nearly destroyed her world. There was no hatred left in her, only a vast, weary pity. "His life is not ours to take," she said, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the glade. "Take him back to the glacial spire. Let him witness the thaw. Let him be judged by the people he betrayed." Weeks later, the great hall of Arendor was a place transformed. Sunlight, real sunlight, streamed through the great window, which was no longer made of ice, but of clear, brilliant crystal imported from the Fireborn's mountain home. The glacial spire, Serain's former throne, had not been rebuilt. It had been allowed to melt, its pure water now feeding a verdant moss garden that grew in the center of the hall, a startling, impossible splash of green. In a palace that had only ever known white and blue, the air was not cold, it was cool, crisp, and clean, like the first perfect day of spring. All around from every archway and parapet came the gentle musical sound of dripping water, the song of the first thaw. Serain stood beside Kelric, not on a dais, but on the floor among the assembled people. Her former subjects and his warriors mingled in a tense but peaceful assembly. They watched her, their faces filled with an awe that was no longer born of fear. They saw a queen who bore the dark, practical leathers of the Fireborn as comfortably as she had once worn her silver gowns. They saw the life in her cheeks, the light in her winter sky eyes that was no longer distant and cold, but clear and present. Kelric stood beside her, a dragon in the form of a man. His presence a quiet, protective warmth that reassured rather than threatened. He was not a conqueror. He was a consort, a guardian, an equal. She had been judged not by a council, but by the land itself. As she had traveled back through Arendor, the thaw had followed her. The snows receded from her path. The rivers began to flow, and in her wake, the first tentative shoots of green began to push their way through the thawing soil. The people knew. Vorlog's lies had turned to dust against the undeniable truth of a returning spring. Now, as she looked out at the faces of the two clans, she saw the future. "Today, the age of ice ends," she said, her voice filling the hall, warm and strong, "and the age of fire is tempered. We were two kingdoms on the brink of annihilation, locked in a stalemate that was poisoning the world. We chose to unite, not just our magic, but our peoples. From this day forward, the Ashen Peak and the Glacial Spire will not be enemies. They will be sister thrones, guardians of a new balance." She turned to Kelric, a silent communication passing between them, a current of warmth and understanding that everyone in the hall could feel. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The warlord had found his peace. The Ice Queen had found her fire. Later, when the hall had emptied and a soft twilight fell, casting long, gentle shadows, they stood together on a high balcony. The wind that blew from the north was no longer a frozen gale. It was a cool, gentle breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and distant pines. Serain held out her hand, palm up to the evening sky. For the first time, she could feel the delicate caress of the wind on her skin. A sensation so simple, so beautiful, it brought tears to her eyes. "I never knew," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A whole world of feeling, and I never knew." Kelric came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against the solid, living warmth of his chest, He rested his chin on her shoulder, his own gaze on the horizon. The constant, raging storm inside him was gone, replaced by the steady, powerful hum of a contained hearth. "And I never knew peace," he murmured into her hair. "Only the fight to control the fire. You are my quiet, Serene. You are my calm." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his scarred, handsome face. She looked into his eyes, those beautiful, terrible embers, and saw not a dragon's fire, but the eternal flame of his soul. It was a flame that no longer threatened to consume. It promised a lifetime of warmth. "You woke me from a living death, Kaelric," she whispered. "And you, my winter queen," he growled softly, his voice thick with a century of repressed longing, "saved me from burning alive." He lowered his head, and this time, there were no alarms, no interruptions. His lips met hers, and the world fell away. It was not a kiss of fire and ice. It was a kiss of sun and earth, of a thunderstorm breaking on a summer afternoon. There was no pain, only a dizzying, overwhelming pleasure, a rightness that resonated in the very core of their beings. It was the taste of ozone, and the scent of the first snow, the heat of the world's heart, and the cool, clear water of a mountain spring. It was the final, perfect harmony of the prophecy, a seal on a bond that was more than magic, more than destiny. It was a choice. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the cool air. Below them, in the gardens where the snows had finally fully retreated, a single, impossible flower, a winter rose, had pushed its way through the thawing soil, its crimson petals unfurling to the twilight. The first thaw had begun.